You know the story, don't you? After attempting to reform the Church of England, 700 Puritans, escaping persecution at the hands of zealous bishops, left their homeland and sailed to the New World. Upon arrival in 1630, the Puritan leader, John Winthrop, and his associates established the government of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the town of Boston. Winthrop envisioned a reformed Christian society, literally a New England, that would serve as a beacon of hope, and that by example would change England and spread throughout Europe. Winthrop said, quote, "We must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill," end quote. The Bible would be the Puritans' legal guide. Where there is no law, magistrates should rule, quote, "as near the law of God as they can," end quote. This story, told to generations of students, speaks to an American idealism, which we hope continues to inspire our country in the 21st century. Yet there is another part of the Puritan story which often goes untold. Just 11 years after establishing the city upon a hill, Governor John Winthrop wrote the first law that legislated slavery in North America. I'm your host, Tom Army, and this is United States History Online. This is part one of a two-part edition on slavery in New England. By the late 1630s, approximately 20,000 people had migrated to New England, causing Winthrop to record in his journal, quote, "Godly people began now to apprehend a special hand of God in raising this plantation," end quote. Later on, the famous Puritan minister, Cotton Mather, would credit Winthrop with the steady success of the young godly society. Mather would write, quote, "Winthrop supports us in our dangers," calling the governor an American Nehemiah because he left behind his position of wealth and influence to share the challenges of his fellow colonists in building a city on a hill. Like the prophet Nehemiah, he sought God's guidance in all things and always thanked God with humility for the many blessings the colony received. Since God had a special hand in establishing the colony, God also tested the faith and resolve of the Puritans. This came, according to men like Cotton Mather, in the form of Native American attacks on Puritan settlements. The first of these came during the Pequot War of 1637. And with the Puritan victory, those Pequots, not slaughtered, were enslaved. Keeping revengeful warriors in the colony, however, seemed too dangerous, although Winthrop himself was known to keep 3 Pequots, a male and 2 females. In 1638, the Native Americans were loaded onto the ship Desire, headed to the West Indies, where the captured Indians would be exchanged for African slaves. The Massachusetts Bay Colony had no issue with slavery. First records indicate that slavery in Massachusetts predated Winthrop. A settler named Samuel Maverick arrived in the area in 1624 with slaves. Second, the Calvinist doctrine of predestination supported the understanding that blacks were a people cursed and condemned by God. And third, slavery was condoned in the Old Testament and therefore not considered sinful towards God. So in 1641, Massachusetts became the first British colony to make slavery legal, passing the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. Rules about slavery included the following, quote, "There shall never be any bond slavery, villanage, or captivity amongst us, unless it be lawful captives taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us," end quote. In other words, Native Americans and Africans could be ruled and sold as slaves. The reference to strangers was derived from Leviticus in the Hebrew Testament. The legalization of slavery in Massachusetts coincided with the English Civil War, which significantly reduced the number of people and provisions arriving in the colonies. Massachusetts' nascent economy derived its wealth from trade, exporting dried fish, timber, and rum to England, Portugal, France, and Spain. Some men in the colony also became experts at shipbuilding and at smuggling. When Parliament passed a series of navigation acts beginning in 1651 that restricted colonial trade, independent-minded Boston merchants worked creatively around the laws. In 1672, Parliament also granted a monopoly to the Royal African Company, a British slave trading company created to make a fortune for the company's investors and the crown. Not to be outdone, the intrepid Massachusetts merchants, boasting a fleet of approximately 200 ships, commenced smuggling slaves from Madagascar and started undercutting the Royal African Company, selling slaves to Virginia starting in 1678, to Connecticut in 1680, and Rhode Island in 1696. Also in 1696, Parliament revoked the Royal African Company's monopoly on the slave trade, opening it legally to all British merchants. Massachusetts and Rhode Island took full advantage of Parliament's decision. It is estimated that by 1745, 40,608 Africans were unwillingly forced to travel to the colonies as slaves. At the same time in Massachusetts, there were 4,500 slaves, about 2.2% of the colony's population. During the mid-18th century, however, as the philosophical underpinnings of democracy and independence were discussed, abolitionist sentiment in Massachusetts grew. Beginning in 1766, freedom suits were brought before the Massachusetts courts. Attorney Benjamin Kent won the first trial in the 13 colonies to free a slave in a case called Slough versus Whipple. In Quock Walker versus Jennison in June of 1781, Walker's attorneys argued that slavery was contradictory to the Bible and the Massachusetts Constitution established in 1780, which declared, quote, "all men are born free and equal," end quote. Quock Walker was from the southern region of the Gold Coast, which today is Ghana. James Caldwell had promised his slave his freedom when he reached the age of 25. Caldwell, however, died when Walker was 10, and Caldwell's widow promised Walker his freedom when he turned 21. Mrs. Caldwell subsequently married Nathaniel Jennison, and her new husband refused to grant Walker his freedom. At age 28, Walker ran away to Seth and John Caldwell, brothers of his original owner, James Caldwell. Nathaniel Jennison found Walker and beat him for escaping. The Worcester Court of Common Pleas determined that Quock Walker was a free man and awarded him 50 pounds in damages. But the issue didn't end there. Jennison sued the Caldwells in the same court and won a settlement of 25 pounds with a ruling that the Caldwells had enticed Walker to leave Jennison. Well, both decisions were appealed. In September 1781, the Massachusetts Supreme Court affirmed Walker's freedom and then reversed Jennison v. Caldwell, arguing that since Walker was a free man, the Caldwells were entitled to employ him. Finally, Massachusetts Attorney General and a signer of the Declaration of Independence, Robert Treat Paine, filed a third case against Jennison for assaulting Walker. The court found Jennison guilty and fined him 40 shillings. Chief Justice William Cushing wrote, quote, "Without resorting to implication in constructing the Constitution, slavery is as effectively abolished as it can be by the granting of rights and privileges wholly incompatible and repugnant to its existence," end quote. Slavery was over in Massachusetts. The federal census of 1790 listed no slaves in the state. Yet the state never formally abolished slavery until the passage of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1865. Why? Historians are not entirely sure, but perhaps Massachusetts feared that escaped slaves from other states would rush to the state if news spread of a formal abolition. I would note that when Frederick Douglass escaped, he came to New Bedford, Massachusetts. One thing was certain: Massachusetts had ostensibly abolished slavery, but not racism.